All right, DBAs in the house. Raise your hand, please. Awesome. Who's used DBA tools before today? Awesome. So I think that's kind of the story. I spent a lot of time consulting before I went to go work at Pure Storage. And I was an independent consultant, and I needed to figure out a way to scale, right, to help my customers do things, because I can only click so fast on a mouse, right? And next thing you know, there's tens and hundreds of servers at my customer sites, and I needed to be able to help manage, configure, and corral these systems to get them to do the things I needed them to do. And that's where DBA tools came in. In fact, in 2016 was the first time I really got started with the DBA tools project, and I really have been a huge advocate of it over the years. Please leave feedback for the session. This will show up again later at the end, but you can definitely leave the positive feedback now, and won't skew your opinions for later. So 3/4 of y'all raised your hands for DBA, using DBA tools as of today, but for the folks that haven't, it's a community-driven PowerShell module. In fact, a good chunk of the major contributors are in this building today, and I'll call out a few of them later in this session. And I think, honestly, this individual project has shifted how we manage database systems in our data centers, going from using techniques of pointing and clicking and batch files and T-SQL files to having a fantastic, homogeneous programmable interface to manage systems. In fact, I barely write T-SQL anymore, right? Because I don't have to, because I come from kind of a more systems-y DBA side of the house than a developer DBA. I manage things for performance and availability and configuration at scale, and that's what DBA tools gave me the ability to do as an individual contributor or as an individual consultant. And so that's really the big bucket items: manage, configure, and deploy. Right? I don't think I've installed SQL Server in the GUI in years because of DBA tools. In fact, one of the sessions I did here a few years ago is how I install DBA, or how I install SQL Server using DBA tools, which is a fantastic way because I can build a repeatable process, right? I can do the same thing over and over and over again. Who has a SQL Server build checklist, right, in their environment? A good chunk of us. And you go and you follow the checklist, and you come back a week later and be like, oh, who missed this? Oh, I built that server, right? And so that's the thing I wanted to be able to avoid, is to be able to build things and do things consistently in code. DBA Tools has a fantastic website, dbatools.io, which is kind of the core place that I go straight to the functions page and look for the thing that I want to do, right? That's going to be core to that. And the GitHub repository. So if you go to github.com/dataplat/DBA tools, it is a very, very, very active project, opening issues, requesting new features. I've done several times over the years, I've asked for a thing to get built, and it gets built, right? Or you can go build it and contribute it to the project. And so that's a lively place to go interact with the team that builds these things, but also with other folks that are using DBA tools. And so the goals for this session really is to kind of show some of the cool things that I was able to do as a consultant to help my customers do the things that they needed to do in their database environments. And I'm going to assume you know PowerShell in this session, basic stuff, not super advanced stuff, but piping, where clauses, things like that. There'll be no splatting or any crazy techniques today in the session. And I've already told the I once was a consultant story. But the idea for me really is write the code, give it to the customer, let them do the things, and let them do those things again and again and again. And that's how you can really impact things at scale, right? Cool. Still kind of like trying to calm down from the AV issue. Not the AV's fault, it's this laptop's fault. It is totally finicky. So there's a really interesting scenario when you work with other commandlets in PowerShell, non-DBA tools commandlets. When you connect to a SQL Server instance, it does a thing and it disconnects right away, which means the next time I come and do a thing, I'm in a completely new and different connection, right? So my SPID changes, and I might want to have context that I flow through in commands. And so we're going to talk about building persistent connections first, what that looks like, and how you can leverage those in DBA tools. The other thing I do a lot in customer environments is getting information, meaning understanding what's out there in my environment, building reports, getting information about configuration. That's really the biggest one that we'll talk a lot about today. And measuring configuration skew is another element that we'll talk about a bunch. And Andrew touched on it this morning in his DR session, but database backup and restores, having an automated way to do database backups and restores. Who here has code to automatically go through and look at a bucket of backups and generate the T-SQL scripts, right? We've probably all tried to write that in our career. You can do it in one line of code in dbatools, right? Bucket of backups and then restore. And so the idea here is when you are in a situation where you do need to restore lots of systems or lots of databases, the ability to do that at scale without having to think, right? That's the core thing. And the other part is if you did write a script, do you have the scripts that measure change over time? There's more likely more databases in your system than there were the day before. And how do you go and make sure that the scripts represent the actual state? And doing it dynamically is going to be the way to do that. I walk into a lot of customer sites as a consultant, and nearly every database, I'd say 90+%, one main data file, one log file, right? Yes, yeah. And being able to get out from that dynamically, one line of code. I've actually written a T-SQL to do this, and it was definitely not one line of code. But balancing or adding database files and then balancing the data across those files, right? And that gives you the ability to do some pretty advanced data management techniques, but you can't do that when you have a giant MDF. Building availability groups in code. Who uses AGs, right? The availability group wizard is like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like the apex of user interface design. You're doing a really complicated thing in SSMS, click, 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 finish, and you're replicating data, you're configuring availability groups, you're changing security, configuring database endpoints, and it's all done in a couple clicks of a mouse. But doing that over and over and over again at scale can be challenging and also error-prone. And so we're going to talk about how to build an availability group in code and how to copy different elements between systems, right? Building AGs, what's the first thing you have to do? Synchronize the stuff, right? The server-level objects. And so we'll look at that. And then also some instance configuration stuff. So any questions or comments, team? Cool, that's the last slide. Well, there's a review slide, so to be truthful. Awesome. So what we're going to do today is just walk through a bunch of code. The code's on my GitHub repo, and it'll be on the conference website. But this is what I want you to be able to walk away with, is to plant some seeds on how we can do some interesting tactics or interesting techniques to manage systems. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'll do is load up a variable for my password, which is a very strong password, something so strong. And I'm going to do all of this in Docker today because I want this to be a repeatable thing for you to do on any system, but it does not have to be Docker by any means, right? This could be 2 Windows systems. I'm just using 2 different containers running on this laptop. So I'm going to go ahead and kick up a container named SQL1, attach a volume to it, and running the latest CU for SQL Server, and I'm going to go ahead and have 2. So I've talked a bunch about containers. That guy right there has talked a bunch about containers. I just deployed 2 SQL servers. Like, that's a really cool, powerful technique to be able to get what you need very quickly on the latest builds of SQL Server. It's CU11. Who here works with Docker containers or SQL Server? Was that not mind-blowing that I just stood up 2 SQL servers that fast? Yeah? Okay, so just to prove to you that they actually exist, I'm going to go ahead and build a credential. And so I'm going to use a PowerShell credential here. Yes, I'm logging in an SA. Please do not judge. This is just a demo. All right, what? Do what I say, not what I do. And that's the first commandlet that I want to introduce, is how to build a connection to a SQL Server instance. And so with the connect DBA instance, I'm going to connect to the system that's running locally on my system on port 1433. And when I do this, it's going to log into that instance, and it's going to give me a reference to that SQL Server. This is a complete SMO object, or SQL Server Management Object. And what SMO is the foundation of what dbatools is built on. It's also the foundation of what SSMS is built on, which means the code is the same. So the SMO objects represent what you can do inside of SQL Server. So the same programmatic surface area is being consumed by dbatools, that's being consumed by SSMS and Microsoft themselves. And so right now I have a persistent connection open to that instance. And if I go and I ask that instance, hey, you know what, give me a listing of all the processes on that instance, I'm going to exclude the system SPIDs, and then I'm going to pipe out the output for just the one that's my exact connection. What you see here is, where's the SPID for that person? It is, there it is, 54. And that's going to persist for the duration of that connection. There's going to be times where you want to connect to an instance and maintain that connection and do multiple things without having to re-authenticate. One example is if you're working with the new T-SQL snapshot feature in SQL Server 22, if you use the regular invoke SQL CMD commandlet in the SQL Server PowerShell module, it connects and disconnects. which then breaks that integration because you've disconnected it, and it will then give you a new SPID the next time you come in. So this is a way to make sure that you have a connection that persists over time. And we can take that object and pass it into other commandlets, which we'll do as we move forward. But just to show you that's an actual SMO object, when I say SMO object, that means all of the properties and all of the methods or the data and the things that I can do to SQL Server are exposed to me programmatically. This is how dbatools programs against SMO. This is how SSMS does as well. And so if you go through this list, it's going to be all of the things that are available. So maybe attach a database, detach a database. These are methods that are exposed. And we can go ahead and interact with data as well. So if I want to get a listing of the databases on this instance from the SMO object, I can say, you know what, let's output that, format the table, but I don't get this great representation of what's occurred because it's the full object getting written out, right? Because I'm just accessing that data directly. But conveniently, dbatools has a commandlet that does just that and gives me well-formatted output based off of that data that we just saw. So if I use get DBA database and I go connect to the instance, which I have that persistent connection to, and I pump that out to format table, I get a much better representation of the attributes that I'm interested in as a DBA rather than just dumping the SMO object to console. And so we can see things like the name, the instance of the name of the database, its current status, and things like that. And so with that, then, there are hundreds of commandlets in the dbatools module to get information about your instance. And so when you're working with a PowerShell, using get command against a particular module, it's going to output all of the commands that are associated with that module, but I want to limit it to just the ones that have the verb get. And so that's what we have in the bottom here, and I have hundreds of different commandlets that get different information about this particular instance and its configuration. So as I'm building integrations, I want to go and find out what's going on at customer sites. This is kind of a way that I use a discovery method. What I haven't covered so far is the ability for this particular variable to also be a list. So right now it's one SQL Server instance. That could be 10 or 100, and I can go interact with all 100 SQL Server instances that are in that variable with one line of code. Right? It's kind of the core to what PowerShell brings to the party from a scaling standpoint. Cool. Any questions or comments around SMO or discovery techniques? Good? Awesome. All right. So we're talking about restoring databases. This was my first real pit stop into dbatools. In 2016, I had a customer that wanted to have a backup happen every day, because, you know, that has to happen, a restore, and then CheckDB, because they wanted to offload CheckDB to another system. I was like, wait, I think I can do this in dbatools rather than doing it in T-SQL and a bunch of batch files to move data around. And so I wrote that integration, and that's kind of what started this whole journey for me to do that. And so that's really was my first stop in the dbatools world, was the backup and restore commandlets. So what I'm going to do first is show you that in that container, I have a stack of backups available to me. So just two backups. One's TPCC, and one is TPCH. And we're going to restore both of those databases without writing a single bit of T-SQL. So with restore DBA database, connecting to that same connection, pointing at a path of backups, I can say restore every user database that's in that path. And it's going to go ahead and do that on my laptop and run that code and tell me exactly what it did. Right? I think this is an amazing thing when you're in a situation where, one, things are down, and you don't have to think about how to write T-SQL to do that. And two, being able to just go and grab those backups and restore them to other systems. And so if I go and I ask SQL Server again, hey, what are the user databases that you have with get DBA database, you can see both of those are already up, running, and ready. But what if we want to go ahead and talk about migration techniques? So log shipping is a fantastic way to move data between two SQL Server instances, right? Especially for migration techniques. But there's a little bit of overhead, I would say, in configuring that, unless you have it scripted. And pretty much the way that I've been migrating databases between versions of SQL Server, between SQL servers, for the last 5 years is this, where the morning of a database migration, I'll take a full backup, okay? So I'll say backup DBA database, connect to my SQL instance, and I'll say, you know what, I'm only concerned about these two databases. So I'm going to load the array for TPCC and TPCH. I'm going to load up that array there, take a full backup, and compress it. And what's going to happen here when I run these 2 lines of code is it's going to write out 2 additional backups to a location, and then it's going to take the output of what occurred and store that in that full backups variable. And so if I look at that object now for full backups, it's exactly what occurred. Right? I took 2 backups of those 2 databases at that time. But there's a lot more information in the full backups object than just that information that we saw. In fact, it's the full contents, of the backup header. Right? So if we look inside of here, just by extracting the variable and getting all the output, you can see some pretty deep dive stuff about what occurred, where the backup lives, its total size, the file listing, all of the goodness that you'd expect in the backup header. And so we can take this information now, and I can connect to that other SQL Server that I started up at the beginning of the session, and I can take full backups and just pipe it to restore database. And I tell it what SQL Server to connect to, and I'm passing in a credential. And most critically, I'm doing no recovery. So what's going to happen here is it's going to restore both of those databases from the metadata that's in that object without me having to say exactly what to do. And it's going to restore both of those, but leave them in recovery. So this is maybe the Friday morning of the migration. I'm going to wait till the evening when the change management comes through, and I'm going to go and, just to show you that they're still in restoring mode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offline the source system. I'm going to take, actually I did not want to offline those right there. Why is that there? Online. This is where demos go south, team, right there. This needs to be 2 lines lower. Here. I'm going to go ahead, so we'll see that the databases are currently in a restoring state. This is where demos fail, team. Let me back up a second here. Restoring, that's in SQL 2. Yeah, we're good. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. So right now I have SQL 1 has the databases up and running. SQL 2 has them restoring. I restored to the full. I'm going to take a diff now. So I'm at the point where I've turned off my applications. I take the differential backup. I have that metadata as well. Offline the source system, and then restore to the second system. Saved that one. But that's how I migrate databases for the last 5 years, is basically take a full the morning of, shut off the applications, take a diff, shut off the database, restore the diff, online the database, and move those systems over. Log shipping is great, but that's 3 lines of code. Sir. So the question, well, I'll have to repeat the question online then. Or for the audience, the question is, are there commands that deal with the complexities of TDE restore? And yes. What you'll want to do in that scenario is the system that you're restoring to, you need the certificate chain that was associated with the TDE encrypted database on the source system, right? So I get the database master key, the service master key, I restore those to the target instance. I have to make sure that the passwords are correct. And at that point in time, this database key, that encrypted database, if that's available, then I'll be able to restore the database to that system. Almost identical to what you do in an availability group configuration. So the question is, can we do all of this stuff that I'm doing with backup and a restore on blob rather than on disk? And in fact, give me like 30 seconds and I'll show that demo. So, cool. All right, any questions here, team? Are we cool with what happened there? I know I got jammed up with the code for a second. So make sure we're all happy with what occurred. All right, who's going to migrate their systems this way this weekend? All right, test, plan, test, plan. So, all right, let's get back into this. So I'm going to burn down one of those containers, SQL 2, and we're going to go ahead and talk about how to do blob restores. This demo is a little challenging to do on the Wi-Fi because of reasons, which I'm sure you've all experienced. So I have this recorded. Forgive me if it's a little bit small, but I'll walk you through the code. But I want to show it live because I think what occurring here is really cool. So lines 143 through 151 are just the syntactical gymnastics to connect to a storage account. Right? So don't worry too much about what's occurring here. That's just me getting a SAS token to talk to my storage account. And then the important part from a SQL Server standpoint, after I run that code, is getting the SAS token and creating a credential. And that's what's happening on line 155 as I'm building up the string to create the credential, and then I create the database credential, which allows my SQL Server instance to talk to Blob to do backup and restores, right? And that's what we're going to do in a second here. So once I run that code, the credential will be created on my local instance. And what's happening on 161 is same exact commandlet as before, backup DBA database, but instead of a file path, I have Azure base URL. I pass in the URL to my blob count, and I just put in the backup. I didn't actually run the backup in the recording because, well, it's like 4 gigs of data, and I just didn't want to wait for that. But I do want to show you this. I have a stack of backups in blob, and so that's what I did here on 165. I'm like, you know what? Give me all of the backups that are in blob that end in .bak, and so that's what we have in the bottom here, being output. As I go forward, this is something that a customer actually asked me to do with their system. What they had is they had all of their backups going into blob, and if my instance goes away, what don't I have anymore is my backup history, right? And so I have to go and generate a restore sequence. And that's what we're doing here. In fact, Joey D'Antoni is a good friend of mine, used this exact technique to do a database migration from on-prem to cloud for one of his customers. And so what I'm asking here on line 170 is, I'm like, you know what? I don't need to look at the 365 days of backups that are in this blob container because I just want the last set of fulls. And so what I'm doing is I'm limiting the number of files that I'm going to go check the backup headers for. Right? Because I don't have to go and look back for a year through all the old backups. So I'm just limiting the scope of the files that are returned. So, you know, like, Azure, give me all of the backup files that were written in the last 7 days. And in there, I have some fulls, I have some diffs, and I have some logs, right? And so that way I don't have to go back and scan 365 days of backup headers to build the resource set because I know there's a full restore set in the last 7 days. So that's just a small performance optimization. So here, when I output that variable, you can see that I'm down to a couple user databases and a couple system databases. I now need to convert the file layout from the format that it is given to me, and I need to just append the actual storage account's URL. And this is where my mind gets blown, right here. So I can take all of that information, and I can use get DBA backup information, and it's going to scan across those files. And again, this could be blob or file. It doesn't have to be blob. So this exact code that I'm writing here, you would just generate the file list slightly differently. And so what this commandlet's doing right now is it's scanning across all those databases and building the restore sequence, okay? And so that does take a second because it's got to go and crack the backup header, read the backup header, do the next one. And so this is all happening over my internet connection at home, so it takes a second. It takes about 9 minutes on the conference Wi-Fi. I tested that. So that's why you're getting it in video. And so once that's done, I have the same exact backup history that I had a few minutes ago when I did the fulls and diffs. And I can do anything I want with that after. And so once this finishes, go ahead and fast forward a little bit, and I output that backup history, I have the backup history for the user databases. And now I can just take that, and on line 199, pipe that into restore DBA database. All right, so imagine this, right? No MSDB, no backup history, no scripts. I just give me a stack of backups and pipe it into get DBA backup info, and then take that and pipe that into restore. That's a pretty nifty DR plan, or the ability to build those scripts. Or you could not have to do this on demand. You could actually generate T-SQL and save that too. So you have that option as well. Any questions or comments about that, team? Good? Ask a question, Andrew. All right, so back to the live demo. So here's all the code for exactly what I did just there, available to you when you get into this code. Excellent. All right. So as promised, let's talk about balancing out database files. Again, nearly every database I walk into, one giant MDF, one usually giant LDF, right? That's used like 99% free, right? And I wanted to fix that. And I wrote a bunch of code years ago in 2015 in blog posts about doing it in T-SQL, and it was super challenging, right? Lots of loops, lots of things that are uncomfortable to do in native T-SQL. And so on this particular system, I can ask for the file layout. So get DBA file is a commandlet that I use pretty often against TPCH database. and I'm going to restrict the output to just the things that I want to look at here. And so you can see one MDF, one LDF, right, for that particular database. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tear down that Docker container, but I'm not going to remove the volume, which is going to leave the database there, because I'm going to reconfigure the Docker container with 4 volumes, one for the MDF and one for 3 or 4 additional NDFs. And again, this doesn't have to be a Docker thing. This is just how I'm doing this on my demo system here. But imagine I just plugged in 4 additional hard drives to my server. That's the output of what I did right there, if this was a Windows system. And so since I did stop and start the instance, I do need to build that connection again. So that's what's happening here on that line of code. And just to make sure everything's still happy before I move forward, those 2 user databases are there, and the file layout's still the same. On SQL Server on Linux, when I add, or even on Windows, I have to make sure that the account that SQL Server runs as has permissions to write data files. And so on 283 and 84, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm just saying, you know what, give SQL Server the permission to work with those 4 new drives that I added, and I'm going to add 4 files. This commandlet here, invoke DBA query, gives me the ability to run just an arbitrary string that is a query. And what's happening on the left here is, or on the right, is just that, is I have the T-SQL to add a database file, and then if I ask Linux for the current state, there we can see the 4 additional files. But what doesn't happen automatically when you add files is it doesn't balance them out, right? I have exactly 4 empty files that I've added to the system. And so this is where the fantasticness of this particular commandlet comes in. Is I run this code, and it's going to walk through and rebuild all the clustered indexes into that new set of files. And so invoke DBA balance database files or data files goes and it rips through all of the indexes and does the hard work for me. 1 line of code. Has anybody actually tried to write that code somewhere along their life as a DBA? Right? I see about 4 or 5 hands. Look at that, right? Yeah. So this was something I used very frequently at customer sites to get systems into a more advanced configuration. So once that finishes, this one's awkwardly long too. Takes a little while. Andrew, sing show tunes.
So I have a question.
Yes.
You say you're doing this all in Docker, but it doesn't have to be Docker?
It does not have to be Docker, no.
Have you tried Podman?
That's the door. We're good friends, if you haven't figured that out. So I have tried Podman. I'm still using Docker. There is your answer. So, all right. Any questions or comments about what's happening under the hood? Yeah.
How was he choosing how to balance it?
So what's the proportional fill algorithm is the answer. Did you see exactly 64K was on each of those? And so SQL Server, when it's rebuilding an index, will allocate extents based off of the one with the least data in it to try to balance it out. And so it's the fact that they were 0 or near 0, 64 bytes, 64 kilobytes, means that it's going to land about even, but it doesn't when I ask. It's almost even, right? So you see 231 is the use space for all of these, but it's not exactly 231 that's left in here because there's some heaps in there that don't have clustered indexes, and this code doesn't handle the heap condition. And the same code I wrote years ago didn't handle the heap condition. What you would do is just add a clustered index and then tear it off to rebalance it out. Cool, good question. All right. Any other questions or comments, team? Good? All right, 20 minutes. All right, so this one I use to this day. I do a lot of testing in the lab with AGs, and what we're going to do here, again, this is going to be in Docker. It doesn't have to be in Docker, but we're going to have an availability group in about 30 seconds. Who's ever built an availability group in 30 seconds other than that guy? Okay, we'll talk. Is it Docker? Yeah? Awesome. Yeah, so the question, or the answer was normal SQL Server and PowerShell, which is the answer here too. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to stop that first container because I need to change some configuration on that system, and I'm going to create a network to attach both of the containers to. This is really just a Docker thing. Don't worry about it so much for doing this in real life, because I'm going to restart the container. I need to add a new configuration variable to enable HADR, which on SQL Server and Linux allows you to create an availability group. And so we're going to create two containers running SQL 1 and SQL 2. The SQL 1 currently has data. SQL 2 is brand new because we deleted the data from earlier. And I'm going to create two SMO connections against SQL instance 1 and SQL instance 2. So 1, 2, they're running on different ports because they're running on the same server on my laptop. And so there we can see it. They're both up and running, and I have persistent connections to both of those. And so going forward, I need to make sure that that second SQL Server has the same file system layout as the first one, because it's not a requirement for AGs, but you can introduce a lot of pain to your life if your file systems and your drive letters don't match on your AGs. Cool. What we're going to do now is use a technique from the Beard. This is a process that I learned from him about how to configure an AG with regards to using certificates. So rather, there's no Active Directory on my laptop, and so I'm going to use certificates as the authentication mechanism between the two different availability groups. My ride's here. So we're going to create a database master key in code, and then I'm going to create a certificate in code. Oops, jumped ahead a little bit. There it is. And then I'm going to back it up. I did not run that code. Let's run that code. It's going to create the cert, and let's back it up. And so this is actually the answer to the question that came first about TDE. This is the same exact process that you would do with regards to the certificates. So now I have a certificate, I have it backed up, and I'm going to restore it on the second instance, because that's what we're going to use to authenticate the database mirroring endpoints between the two availability group replicas. I'm going to create a stub database, because what I don't want to do is when I create an AG, have like 7 terabytes of data that needs to replicate. I usually just create a test database, nothing in it. I put it in full recovery mode, and then I take it out of pseudo full recovery mode and put it in real full recovery mode by taking a full and taking a log. And so I'm using the DBA database, or backup DBA database command to do just that. So 1, 2. And best practice is backing up to null. Right? No? Okay. Again, this is a test system. But that's the layout of the system. So I have two SQL servers, SQL 1, SQL 2. I've configured an authentication mechanism between the two using certificates. And I created a stub database on the first one, and I'm going to have an AG in about 30 seconds, right? So new availability group against the primary and secondary, give it a name, that's the database. I'm using cluster type none because this is it's the lab system that I'm using here on my laptop, but if this was a failover cluster, like a real Windows failover cluster, you would pass in WSFC as the parameter there, having already previously created the cluster. The failover mode is manual because I'm using no cluster type, automatic seeding, pass in the cert. I use verbose output because I love green text flying across my screen. It looks really cool when people walk by on my desk, right? And so lots of things are happening under hood here, right? It's configuring all the database mirroring endpoints, it's configuring the security associated with that, and now I have an AG. And when I go through and I ask, hey, what's the status of the AG? I connect it to SQL 1. It's currently the primary. The AG is AG1, and it's a cluster type none, and there's 2 replicas and other configuration elements. And with that, I can then take the database that's currently in there, that actual, I think it's just 1.5 gigabytes of TPCH. I want to make sure it's in full recovery mode. Take a pair of backups again for a full and a log to make sure it's in the correct state to add it to the AG, and then add it to the AG. All right, so that's going to go ahead and add DBA AG database to, from SQL Instance 1 to SQL Instance 2 for that particular AG. I limited it to just that one database, automatic seeding. All the cool stuff that flew behind this on the screen a second ago is the actual seeding process, which is generally very challenging to monitor. And it is now in my AG. And so we can see the synchronization state between the two. TPCH synchronized, TPCH synchronized on the 2 instances there. And so that technique, again, even outside of my consulting practice, where I work now, I use that to build all of the AGs that I have to work with on my systems. Any questions or comments about that, team? What's up?
How would you establish the core
So the question is, how would I establish quorum? This is a test box. The cluster type was none intentionally, right? Because I just playing around. If it was a real cluster, I would have created the cluster first with the cluster commandlets from Microsoft. So I think it's like new cluster, which would then add the nodes, and I would pass that cluster name into the commandlet that I used to create the AG. And so that's all code that is available to use. Cool. Good? Cool. Totally lost track of time. All right, so now I have two AGs up. I have a database running, but I have some other work I have to do to synchronize these things. And so when I'm working with certain objects, there's a commandlet called sync DBA availability group, which will synchronize the server level objects between the two AG replicas. I'm a little more high maintenance than relying on one individual commandlet to do these things, because I might want to be a little more scoped in the things that I do. And there are parameters for that commandlet to limit the things that it replicates, but I guess I'm just a control freak, right? And so what I'll do is I'll discreetly say, what are the objects that I want to replicate between these two things? And you might not want to do this automatically. What I would do at my customer sites is I would actually use these commandlets to build agent jobs that would run on the replicas and compare them and then send me an email and say, this thing, whether it's a database, a link server, a login, is not on all of the replicas. And then I would go decide if I would go do that thing and create that object on all of the things in the database, because someone could have created a login that I didn't know about that I don't want to have replicated. So that's why I wouldn't let that automatically replicate between the systems. But let's go ahead and create a bunch of logins on SQL 1 and create a bunch of users in the database on SQL 1. And if I look, I'm going to connect to both servers now. If I look at the output here, we can see I have a bunch of users on SQL 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're not on SQL 2. How many of us have had an outage because of this? Right? Almost half the room. And one of the things when you're doing HA or HA and DR planning is nobody cares that those logins weren't synced. You had an outage, right? And so this is going to help you be able to prevent those things from occurring. And so building jobs that scan the system, find those logins that aren't there, and let you know, hey, there's new logins there. And then when you're done, or if you want, you can just run one command that will sync them between the two, and this does this the right way, meaning that the SIDs go along with it, so it's the actual exact same account, right? And so if you're not familiar with the authentication mechanism of SQL Server, SQL Auth and Windows Auth have a security identifier, which is a hex string that represents the exact user, and that hex string is what's burned into the database when I assign a permission. Not the string name Anthony, but the actual hex representation of that object is what's written into the database. So even though Anthony might be on both of these replicas, if I didn't use this technique or the sp_help rev login from Microsoft, if I just created an Anthony user on that system and I fail over, what's going to happen? Outage, right? And so that's an important way or an easy way to solve that problem. And so very quickly, I can ask both systems what they have, and we can see I synchronize those. Right there and right there. Cool. Any questions or comments around that? What's up? One more time, please.
So on the creation of the databases on the second,
Yeah.
would that create the same object database ID? I'm just thinking of things like if you want to query store to retain.
Okay. So the question is, if I create a database on a secondary replica, does it get the same database ID? And I don't think I think the answer is no. I'm like 99% sure. Does anybody know that for sure? Okay.
What will happen is that if you wanted to apply static query store,
Right. Right. 99% sure that it isn't going to be the same database ID, because you can imagine a scenario where that secondary replica had test DB1 and 2. By the time I went and synced TPCH over to that, what's going to get the next database ID, right? Yeah, so you're totally right there. What's up?
You come across a way of being able to check passwords across
So the question is checking passwords across instances on different nodes. I don't know. I'm not a security nerd. Because the passwords are going to be salted, which means the actual value that's written into the thing, if I create them at 2 different times, is potentially different, right? And so you're going to have to, how would you do that? You'd have to have some sort of external test that would check if the password's valid. That's probably the best way to handle that. Do you have a question or comment?
When you say copies logins, is it just user logins, or you could perhaps different login?
So the copy login, so the question is, what are the other options for copy login? So is that what you're thinking? Yeah, so I can exclude logins, right? I was just heavy-handed saying, give me all of the users and throw them over there. But I could definitely scope that if I needed to.
I was thinking of whether it copies certificate logins over and stuff like that.
That's going to come with what we did up here when I did the this right here. So yeah. So this actually, I was subtle about what I did here intentionally, and I only have 10 minutes left. Is I wrote the backup certificate to a shared location. Really cool is when I do get DBA file, I can actually read the byte stream so that it doesn't have to be a shared location. So I write to the one, I read the byte stream back in, and I can pass that into the other objects. I don't have to have a shared file system. In this case, I just happen to have a shared file system, which has always been a pain when you're synchronizing certificates because you have to get them between the two servers, which there might be a security boundary between those that causes you grief. All right, so 10 minutes left. Let's get into some configuration stuff. Again, so I started the session off by asking who had a build checklist and who came back later and said, oh, you know what, who built the server? Oh, it was me because I forgot to do this thing. And so I found myself doing that a lot, but I also find that a lot of customer sites where you have skew in configuration, right? And that's really what I want to go after with these kind of commandlets is making sure that the things I think are configured are actually configured. So earlier I introduced the concept of being able to hit multiple SQL servers in one commandlet, and that's what we're going to do here. So I'm taking the 2 connections that I have built, and I'm adding them to an array called SQL instances. And now I can go in one line of code, I can set the DBA max memory on both of those instances at the same time. Now, that's not the only command that can do this. Every commandlet in PowerShell, mostly, has the ability to handle this scenario. And so what happens inside the commandlet is it'll go and it'll execute that command on both of the SQL Server instances. And so that's the output that I have at the bottom here is I took a system that had no configuration, so SQL 1 and SQL 2. There's a default value for max mem on both of those. And the commandlet itself goes and determines what's an appropriate value, for those 2 systems and it sets it for you without having to go and touch all of those instances. And so that is a way that I was able to go and make sure that systems have lots or have the appropriate config. Similarly, I always loved SP Who is active. So I go to customer sites and they wouldn't have any tooling. There's no monitoring. And so this is the way. If you aren't familiar with SP Who is active, it's an advanced way to look at the workload that's running on the system. And so this is kind of one of the ways when I would go into sites is to make sure that things are configured properly and also have the tooling that I need to do these things. But you're not going to go and run a bunch of individual commandlets on servers. And so there's a testing framework called Pester. Right? What Pester does, it'll execute command, it'll look at the value of the output, and you define, is that output good or bad? Right? Does it pass the test or does it fail the test? And so what I would do for my customers is I would write a series of post-installation checks using commands like get DBA max memory. Because I would define what I think is good, best practices, and I'd write the code to go check those things at my customer sites. And so what a Pester test looks like is this. I can pass in, or it'll process an array of SQL servers, and in this case, the Pester test for checking if the memory settings are proper is what we see here. So we have a test named test for instance level settings. The context is the memory configuration, and then I'm going to go and it's going to execute this command against the particular system, and it's going to store that in that memory variable. Line 16 is going to read the recommendation out from the command because that's potentially dynamic based on the amount of memory in the system. And then I'm going to find out, you know what, is it what I want it to be? Is the max value the recommended value. If it passes that value, then the test passes. If it doesn't match, the test fails. And so I'd build these tests across multiple facets of the system: DOP, backup retention, backward compression, whatever I thought was the best practice for my customers. And so another one there is DOP, right? And so checking both instance level DOP and database level DOP for a system. And so I'd go and I'd run these tests at a customer site like this. And I'd invoke a pester test, and it goes and it runs these tests against all the SQL servers that I wanted to run it against. So this particular test ran the checks that we just defined for DOP and max memory against both of the servers that we have up and running. Luckily, it passed all the tests because we just configured it a few minutes ago. And so pesters are a good way to kind of level up that check game so you can go through and build automated checks. And so I would take this, I'd configure a customer environment, everything would be green. I'd leave, I'd come back 11 months later, I'd run this again. And then I'd find what changed, and then have hard conversations with folks after that, right? And see, help me identify configuration skew. Since this is the SQL bits of AI, one of the things I've been playing around over the last few weeks is with Copilot. Is anyone using GitHub Copilot? Yeah? All right, let's do this. Hopefully this demo works. So give me a DBA tools. All right, so to check the max memory on an instance. But maybe, what's another thing that you'd want to get out of a SQL Server? Let's do this live. Anybody want to? Okay. The cost of a SQL Server. All right. Oops. There we go. Tab. All right, so get DBA as pconfigure is the commandlet against the one SQL instance that we have up and running, pass in the credential. In this case, it's going to pipe the output to retrieve the correct variable. And so let's see if I get the right thing. And it did not work. I have no idea why, because this is a live demo. But let's see what happens there. Oops. Yeah, it actually should be in there. So cost threshold of parallelism. I wonder why that failed. But this is something I literally messed with last night because I'm watching all the stuff this week. But the idea here is you don't have to be a pro in DBA tools like day zero. Right? Copilot, I typed in a line of code, cost threshold of parallelism. It's in there because it output all of the different configuration parameters from the SQL Server instance, but the string match on that particular thing didn't fail. So we are. What is it? Oh, thank you. If he's right, then I have to buy him 2 beers. Like that? Yep. Yeah, one, thank you. So one of the things I did find out about GitHub Copilot specifically in practicing for this is the body of work that supports GitHub Copilot is all of GitHub, right? And so there's code out there that's older, that might have different commandlet names. As projects move forward in time and standardize for things and become more mature, things change. And so the first couple of times I did this, I got commandlets that have been long deprecated. But that's not DBA tools' fault. That's just the body of work that's in GitHub right now that GitHub is looking at. So your mileage may vary, and obviously the field name or the property name that I was trying to pull out there didn't match either. But that's a lot easier than me having to go and, well, it's easier to have Andrew in the room. But the idea is I didn't have to go and type all that stuff out, and I was able to slam dunk that very quickly. I have 1 minute left. That's actually it. So let's go ahead and wrap it up with this. I'm going to put this back up here in a second, but I want to do this. This is the team that built DBA tools and many other people. Chrissy, The Beard, Jess, Claudio, Sander, 4 of those folks are in this building today. Just go say thanks. They changed the way that we manage systems and databases. Fantastic folks. They wrote a book on this stuff with many more pages and different perspectives on how to do the things that DBAs do. Because I did it a certain way doesn't mean it's the right way. It's just the way that I did it. But thank you all for coming, and please leave some feedback. The code will be available in many different places after the session is over. So thank you.